I will not delay any further than in starting. I want to welcome everyone today, this afternoon, to the University of New Orleans. I'm really excited that we're going to be holding the inaugural lecture of what will become an annual lecture on the Cold War, which is going to be delivered by recently retired UNO professor, Dr. Günter Bischof. And so this is a really exciting occasion. This was an idea that we had and we developed with Günter. We wanted to make sure that in retirement, he wasn't going to start to get lazy and take days off. We wanted to make sure he was plugged into the history profession still. But a major reason for this lecture is also as a way to help raise money for the scholarship fund that his family and particularly his children were really instrumental in starting. And so in a second, I'm going to ask Günter's wife, Melanie Boulay, to say a few words about that. But I just want to say before then that I think this scholarship fund, which will go towards helping UNO students to travel abroad, to maybe study and research in Europe, I don't think there could be a more fitting tribute to Bischof, who has been a tireless educator here at UNO, who has done so much for UNO students. And I think this is just an excellent way to continue that legacy. I also want to say welcome to our viewers on Zoom. We do have a number of people joining us from all corners of the world. And just to let you all know that you can also ask questions at the end of the talk if you have them. Your Zoom should have a function to enter a question, and I'll be monitoring those towards the end. So yes, now I'd like to introduce our speaker. First, I should really quickly say my name is Mark Landry. I am the current director of the Austrian Marshall Plan Center for European Studies here at UNO. I teach in the history department, and it is my honor to introduce our speaker, Dr. Günter Bischof. Günter taught contemporary American and European history here at UNO. He came here in 1989 and taught for almost 35 years. He has been a guest professor at the, here comes a long list of universities, University of Munich, Salzburg, Innsbruck, Vienna, Prague, the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and the RGGU University in Moscow. He served for over 20 years as the director of the Austrian Marshall Plan Center for European Studies, otherwise known as Center Austria. And he is an international historian who has focused on American and European diplomatic history of the 20th century, and especially Cold War international relations. He is the author of numerous books and countless articles on the Cold War. And if I tried to read even a sampling, we would be here for a lot longer, and I would rather get to the talk. So, but some of his books were The First Cold War, Austria in the First Cold War, The Leverage of the Weak, and the Marshall Plan since 1947, Saving Europe, Rebuilding Austria. He has written recently a book on the Cold War in Austria that came out in German in 2022, and it is currently being translated for publication with UNO Press. And that is a history of Austria in the Cold War, a balancing act between East and West. And finally, I'll just mention one recent honor. He was awarded the Grand Silver Honorary Cross from the Austrian president for his contributions to transatlantic Austrian-American relations. I'm looking forward to the talk, but before we get to the talk, I wanted to call up his wife, Melanie Boulay, who has a few words for us.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks so much to Mark and Gertraud and Hannes and DC too for organizing this lecture for us from the university. And I just wanted to give a couple of personal remarks on my husband and his career. So it's almost surreal to think that Günter has been retired for a year now. Not sure where that time has gone, but really his basic routine of reading 800-page books and writing reviews about them has not changed. So thank you all for coming today, and also to our guests on Zoom. On the occasion of Günter's retirement, our three kids, Andrea, Marcus, and Xander, took the extraordinary measure of establishing a scholarship in honor of their dad's career in hopes that others will follow in his footsteps and make new contributions to the historical record. They established the Dr. Günter Bischof Endowed Scholarship for Travel and Research. To those who have already contributed, thank you so much. And we're hoping to get a link on this in the chat today, if we can, for those contributions. Next year, we'll see the first of those scholarships awarded by Center Austria in the history department. And we plan to use this lecture series to inform you of those students who get it and of their research topics. Before I hand over the mic to Günter, though, I just wanted to offer a personal observation about his career. And that is that despite his prolific publishing and loaded teaching schedule, despite the fact that he taught every summer of his academic career just to make financial ends meet for the family, he simultaneously shared all of the household and child-raising tasks. He changed diapers, starting off changing diapers. He mopped. I was the vacuum cleaner person, and then he'd follow me mopping, and he was faster than me mopping than I was at vacuum cleaning. I still haven't figured that out. Took the kids crabbing in the mornings, attended their biddy basketball games, cooked. In fact, at one point I was on the local school board and I overheard a conversation of my kids saying, you know, Poppy really cooks better than Mom. And that's when I decided not to run again. Like I mean, we can do it evenly, but I'm not taking the back seat there. Anyway, he pressure washed the house every year. He was the chauffeur extraordinaire. He taught soccer and history in the elementary schools of our kids as a volunteer. So I just wanted to express my eternal gratitude to someone who was, offered me definitely an equal partnership and to the true teamwork it took to raise the kids in lieu of an amazing career. Thank you. Günter.
Welcome, everybody. Thanks for being here. It's a pleasure to see so many of you students, colleagues. Associate Dean Dr. Penzer is here with us. Thanks for being here. Melanie and Mark, thank you very much for your kind words. Also, I wanted to thank my kids, if they're on Zoom, which I assume they are, for starting the scholarship funds and for their generosity in putting in lots of money. So we'll be able to hand out money to UNO students, which is an exciting prospect. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is on the Berlin Wall.
One moment.
Yeah. Now let me try again. Yeah. Well, there we go. Yeah. Okay. So. Yeah. Okay. So the Berlin Wall, of course, is a big symbol of the Cold War, and I'm going to talk about the history of it today. 35 years ago, the Cold War ended and the Berlin Wall came down, and that's sort of the ostensible occasion for this talk. That was 35 years ago. You know, the fall of the Berlin Wall was sort of a major signal of the end of the Cold War, which is in itself a historical era that we need to pay attention to. Okay, so the whole thing started with Berlin being destroyed in 1945, a destroyed city. I mean, you see here just the ruins of Berlin.
I don't know if this is going to take a few more minutes, but I already know what question I want to ask.
Okay, ask it now and we'll address it. Yeah.
35 years and a few months ago, I was in Innsbruck teaching on the UNO program, And I didn't know of anybody anywhere who foresaw the fall of the wall a few months later. Was there anybody who foresaw the fall of the wall in the summer of 1989?
No, I mean, no, not really. That's a really good question. US intelligence should have known, but they didn't know. So it came as a complete surprise, and I'm going to talk a little bit about it in terms of what the surprise was that it came down. But it really was the events of the fall of 1989 that brought it about. And nobody really foresaw that in the summer of 1989 when we were all in Innsbruck. It's a good question. And it's one of the big perplexing questions about these events, why nobody saw it coming.
Yeah.
So you could say it's one of those big US intelligence failures, like the Battle of the Bulge. Okay, let me just talk about it. Maybe it's going to come on. So I wanted to start with the ruin that was the city of Berlin, which of course was a result of Hitler's empire being defeated, both by the Russians who took Berlin and the Americans who didn't really go to Berlin, but who wanted, at least some Americans like General Patton wanted to go to Berlin and fight the Russians. So then the city, after the war, was divided up by the four occupation powers that occupied Germany. The Soviet Union in the east, the Americans in the south, the British in the north, and the French sort of in the west of Germany. And the situation was similar in Berlin. So the city was divided up into four sectors. It sort of started to go pretty well until the Western powers decided to launch a currency reform in the western sectors of Berlin. And the currency reform brought about then the Berlin Airlift. The Soviets shut down the land access routes to the city. Okay, so the Americans and the British decided they're going to try to supply a city of roughly 2 million people from the air, which they did for an entire year. Every 3 minutes, the plane landed full of stuff, including, fuel. I mean, it was not only food, it would be fuel, industry to go, and so forth. So it was really a miracle that they managed to supply the city. And it was a huge defeat for Stalin. So in May 1949, Stalin decided he's going to give up the blocking of the access routes, and that then also meant the end of the airlift. So a big victory, if you will, for the Western powers in the Cold War. Now, the Soviets were sort of smarting from this failure, and in 1958, when Khrushchev had come to power after Stalin's death, which happened in 1953. So Khrushchev was in power, and he decided he'd make an offer to Ulbricht, the East German leader, the GDR leader, to essentially hand over Soviet rights to the East Germans. That was the idea. So that way, Ulbricht could have shut down the access routes again. He could have blocked the Western powers. Of course, by now, West Berlin had become an eyesore to the East Germans, because the big problem for East Germany was that there was a lot of refugees who left the city in the east through the western zones of Berlin into West Germany. There was thousands of refugees of this sort, and usually it was the best trained and best educated people that left. So as a result of this big exodus of East Germans, Ulbricht put a lot of pressure on Khrushchev to sort of build a wall, to wall off the western sectors of Berlin. And this is what happened. About 160 kilometers of wall were built around, if you can imagine that, the three western zones, to make it difficult for people to flee. Now, people, they continued to try to get into the West, but now it was much more difficult because of the wall. And if you ever go to the museum in Berlin called Checkpoint Charlie. It's a wonderful museum. You would see a tribute to human ingenuity. People tried all kinds of ways to get through the wall into the West. They would dig their way under it. They would hide in cars to get through. They would construct airplanes, helicopters to get over the wall. So a tribute to human ingenuity. About 180 people died doing this. So it was also a big human tragedy, if you will. And in fact, a lot of East Germans had to pay a price when the wall came down for being responsible for killing people who had fled. You sort of get an idea how through these air corridors, the airplanes flew into West Berlin and supplied the city. Let me see whether I can keep going. Yeah, you probably have to keep doing it manually. Okay, so in 1962, Khrushchev and Kennedy met in Vienna for a summit meeting. And since nothing, even though Berlin was discussed at this point, since nothing went forward, the Soviets a few weeks later, really in August of 1962, decided to build the wall. So the wall was built, and that sort of ends the second Berlin crisis because it stops this huge exodus of refugees going to the West. Yeah, you see again, you see the city and the wall being built around the Western sectors. Yeah. And then the attempts of digging under the wall or trying to get to the West. Okay, let's go, Mark. Now, if you looked at the wall, it looked very different from the Western side than from the Eastern side. From the Western side, there was a lot of wall art that went up the Eastern side. You see sort of a schematic view of what happened. The wall was built, and there was a Todesstreifen, an area that you had to cross, and usually where people would perish if they tried to cross it, as they tried to get to the West. So it was sort of more than one wall. It was really a whole system of edifices that made leaving the East very difficult. Yeah. Now, it was also difficult for Germans to see their family, say West Germans living in the West, to see their family if the family lived in East Germany or in East Berlin. And this only stopped in the early 1970s when Willy Brandt was the Chancellor of Germany. And he particularly was someone who wanted a détente, an easing of tensions in the Cold War, so the Berlin issue could be resolved. You see Willy Brandt going from Poland to Eastern European countries. Here in Poland, the famous Kniefall von Warsaw, going onto his knees as an apology to the Poles, what happened in their country. And I was in Poland this summer. Indeed, a lot happened in Poland during World War II. So he then signed an agreement with the East Germans, and eventually this resulted in an easing of tensions between East and West Germany, and it allowed East Germans to come and travel to West Germany and vice versa. So it really opened up, if you will, this division between the two Germanys. So Willy Brandt had a lot to do with that. Yeah, let's go. Now, in 1980s, things started with Gorbachev becoming the leader of the Soviet Union in 1985. So, Chris, that might be one explanation, Gorbachev's policies beginning to ease tensions with the West. Now, of course, there was Ronald Reagan, who was the American president during that time. And in 1987, he gave a famous speech in front of the Berlin Gate. And he said the famous words, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Now, I've once written a paper comparing President Kennedy's trip to Berlin with Reagan's trip to Berlin. And I've come to the conclusion that even though Americans remember Reagan's trip to Berlin, that Kennedy's was much more successful. There was much more enthusiasm by the people of Berlin for Kennedy than for Reagan. So in that sense, you can't really see this, but in terms of the context of the entire trip, I argued in this paper that the Kennedy visit was a much more successful one if you look at the people of Berlin and the welcome that he received. Okay, let's go on. So then come the famous events of 1989. So in a way, it started with a summit meeting on Governor's Island in New York Harbor in December 1988 when Reagan, Bush, and Gorbachev met. So this was already at the time when Bush had been elected and Gorbachev came to New York. He gave a famous speech before the United Nations, and essentially in this speech, he pretty much called the end of the Brezhnev Doctrine to be the case. Now, the Brezhnev Doctrine, if you recall, was proclaimed in 1968 after the events in Czechoslovakia, where the Soviet leader Brezhnev said that the Soviet Union had a right to intervene in its zone, if you will, in Eastern Europe whenever Soviet interests were threatened. So Gorbachev called an end to this Brezhnev Doctrine, which also meant the Soviets no longer would intervene, particularly in places like Poland. But Gorbachev particularly hoped to get maybe information from Bush, the new president, what he would intend to do. However, Bush took his time in defining his Eastern European policy. And Bush sort of took his time, and only by the spring of 1989, when he had been in the White House for half a year, did he begin to make some famous speeches where he essentially pronounced his policy to be beyond containment. Now, if you remember, containment meant the containment policy went back to 1947. Supposedly, George Kennan had defined it. He later on denied it in his memoirs. But it became American policy to contain Soviet communism wherever it raised its ugly head. Now, this might be in Western Europe through things like the Marshall Plan, but eventually it more and more became to be American policy in the so-called Third World, or what today we call the Global South, which was decolonizing. And whenever communism tried to seize territories in the Third World, the Americans would fight it too with the containment policy. And of course, this was behind the Vietnam War. This led the United States into Vietnam, yeah. Okay, now, one of the signal events of 1989 was when the Austrian foreign minister and the Hungarian foreign minister here, this was a big photo op, they cut through the Iron Curtain on the Austro-Hungarian border, but the Iron Curtain there had begun to fall at the beginning of May. This was at the end of June when they seized this opportunity to do it for the photograph. So essentially, what happened in early May was that the Hungarians decided to let the Iron Curtain come down, which then encouraged a lot of East Germans who vacationed in the summer of 1989 in Hungary to sort of flee across the green border between Hungary and Austria and go into West Germany. This was thousands of people who did it. So in that sense, you could say the Austro-Hungarian border was the first time that the Iron Curtain was coming down between the two systems. And that was the beginning of the big events of 1989, which then continued, of course, afterwards. So at this time also happened the Polish Round Table, which was all Polish parties coming together to negotiate what should happen with Poland. And this included Solidarity, the labor union, which was now becoming a party. And essentially, out of the round table came the decision to hold a free election in June of 1989. And in this free election, to everyone's surprise, so this was a big turning point too, the communists were voted out of office. And parties like Solidarity took over power in Poland. So in that sense, the Polish Roundtable sent a very important signal. And at the same time, in the summer of 1989, George Bush had sort of made up his mind that he would become more active vis-a-vis Eastern Europe, and he traveled to Poland and to Hungary. The two countries essentially where things were happening in Eastern Europe. And he also traveled to West Germany and met Chancellor Kohl to discuss what would be the future of Germany. But importantly, when he went to Poland, he met Lech Walesa, the Solidarity leader who later on became the president of Poland. And the Poles essentially expected something like a Marshall Plan for Poland, meaning a big American aid package that might resolve their debt problems with the West. However, Bush said, I have plenty of economic troubles at home. I can't give you that. So later on, the international community, including a lot of Western Europeans, poured a lot of money into Poland. But it was not the Americans who saved the Polish economy. So Poland played an important role in the events that would unfold in 1989. And then things started to happen in East Germany. Now, East Germany celebrated its 50th anniversary of the existence of the state on October 7th, 1989. And Gorbachev, on this occasion, came to East Germany. But he gave a warning to Honecker, the East German leader. He said, those who don't react to life will be punished. In other words, he expected Honecker to sort of go along with the protests which were already rocking and shaking East Germany. Various civic movements, particularly organized through churches, were beginning to protest the East German government. And Gorbachev issued a warning. And you see here, I mean, the most famous such protests were in Leipzig and in Dresden, two of the cities of East Germany. But here in Berlin, Alexanderplatz, November 4th, 1989, hundreds of thousands of people protested. So the protests grew bigger and bigger. And very importantly, the East German government, and Honecker in October was sort of voted out of office, decided not to apply the Chinese solution to events in East Germany, which is to say that what happened on Tiananmen Square, where the Chinese government rolled over protesters with tanks, that would not happen in East Germany. There was a conscious decision by the East German government that they would not do that, which in a way then allows the protester and these civic movements to continue their ongoing protests. And that would lead to the culmination, Chris, that I was briefly mentioning before. Yeah, let's go on. And you see here, the first breaches in the wall took place on November 9th. If you go on, Mark. It was sparked by this infamous press conference by Günter Schabowski on November 9th, 1989. In this press conference, essentially reporters asked him whether it was true that the government had decided to let people go through from east to west through the wall. And Schabowski said, yeah, that was true, even though he had not really agreed with that answer with the East German Politburo. But this was sort of a surprising event to many people, because you realize East Germans already saw through West German television, which was beaming into their living rooms, that the policy was changing, and that the East German government was beginning to think about letting the Berlin Wall come down. And Schabowski sort of said, yeah, the transfer would be possible from east to west. And as a result, that night on Bornholmer Straße, Mark, if you go on, Bornholmer Straße, one of the transfer points from east to west, people began to flood to West Germany, and the famous events of then November 9th and the days thereafter of 1989 began to unfold. And the wall in that sense was beginning to come down. But this, the question that Dr. Day asked is absolutely the correct one. This was not really foreseen by anyone. This came as a big surprise, even though if we put the events together, like I'm trying to do it, you know, what happened in Eastern Europe, it sort of made sense that East Germany would see the same kind of issues that Poland and Hungary saw. In that sense, you need to see all of the Eastern European events together. But it led to the coming down of the wall. And you saw this incredible enthusiasm that people developed in taking apart the wall. And you see it here. And that happened in the days after November 9th, how people sort of tore down the wall with their bare hands. So it was a veritable hysteria that developed, and you might remember these images. They also could be seen on American television. You know, the anchors like Tom Brokaw and so forth went to Berlin in order to take note of all of this. So in that sense, it came as a surprise to the journalists too. And this is the pictures we saw. And yeah, let's go to the next one. And what then very quickly followed is that the West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl took matters into his own hand, and he proclaimed at the end of November already, to everyone's surprise, a 10-point program where he was already envisioning events that would lead to German unification. That then became the big issue. So the 10-point program by Kohl, where he spoke of confederative structures, became a very important event. And then in the next big event would be the Malta summit, when Gorbachev and Bush met on the Mediterranean island of Malta. It was also called sometimes the Seasick Summit, because there was big waves, a big storm coming through the city of La Valletta, where they were in boats. And Bush was supposed to go to the Soviet boat, and then vice versa. They conferred on boats, and the seas were so rough that they couldn't do it. And some people actually got so sick that they threw up. But you see him here sitting together and trying to decide what should happen with Germany. Now, the French and the British and the Soviets, Gorbachev didn't really want to move as fast as Kohl was moving. But Bush said he couldn't do anything. He couldn't really stop Kohl, meaning the Americans would have to support German unification because they had supported it for a long time through the Cold War. So in a way, the Malta summit of December 1989 really became the summit that ended the Cold War more than anything. And so what came onto the agenda in Malta and thereafter with Kohl's 10-point program was German unification. And that happened in the year of 1990. There was an election in Germany and had surprising results. The CDU, the Christian Democrats, which is Kohl's party, did well in East Germany. So it would not be the communists, sort of like in Poland, who would rule, but it rather would be the Christian socialists. So the 2+4 negotiations then ensued, which was negotiations between the two Germanys and the four occupation powers to sort of decide the future of Germany. And out of that 2+4 negotiations came the elections of October 1990. And those elections pretty much set the stage for things to come with a clear CDU victory. Yeah. Now this map is very important. You sort of see the international situation. What should be the future of East Germany in terms of its security status? And for a while, they were actually thinking of German unification with the East German 7 provinces staying neutral. But that didn't make sense. So the West Germans and the Americans went along with it, insisted that all of Germany should become part of NATO. So Germany joined NATO as a whole, and subsequently in two more big expansion steps, Poland and Eastern Europe and the Baltic states turned NATO member too. And this is essentially the big issue for Putin today, that NATO, in his mind, had moved too far to the east. And of course, Georgia was discussed becoming part of NATO for a while, which is much further east. And then, of course, Ukraine too. And this is essentially what's behind, if you wonder what's behind the Ukrainian war, I would say this is the principal reason that Putin never has accepted NATO moving eastward. And here on the map, you see clearly how it happened. And a lot of it had to do with German unification and all of Germany becoming part of NATO. So it was then easier to tolerate Poland and Czechoslovakia, or the Czech Republic and Slovakia, becoming part of NATO too. And I think whenever I discuss this issue, people say, sort of conspiracy theorists say, that essentially the Soviet Union had been betrayed because East Germany should have stayed neutral and shouldn't have become part of NATO. So there's a lot of people who believe that notion that what happened in 1989-90, the negotiations with Gorbachev, the West sort of abandoned the promises that it made. And this is what the Soviet Union has never accepted, and particularly Putin has never accepted. And this is behind all the turmoil in Eastern Europe. So that is essentially something that also points us towards what's happening in Germany. As you probably know, in Germany, the Ossis are very discontent, meaning the East Germans, with the situation that has arisen, and particularly the economic situation they are in. And notice more recently in the East German Bundesländer, the new Bundesländer of the former GDR, there is a right-wing party, the ADF, the Alternative for Germany, Alternative für Deutschland, which is essentially gaining a lot of votes and is becoming quickly the strongest party, particularly in the eastern provinces in East Germany. And all of this is also a result of the discontent of the East Germans, the way unification has happened, where very often they lost their jobs and very often West Germans came in and became the leaders of their companies and of their universities and so forth. So I would say that's sort of where I want to end. I want to quickly just show you that there is a memory that has developed over the wall, and these pieces of wall are in all major museums in the world. I saw one over at the Bush Library at Texas A&M University. This is the one that's in Simi Valley out in the Reagan Library. So everybody wants to have a piece of wall as a memento of the events of 1989. And of course, you can also, as an individual, buy pieces of the wall, smaller pieces of the wall. I remember I always showed my students when I gave my Cold War lecture on this event, a piece of the wall which I once bought in Berlin. Everybody can do that. Pieces of the wall are very available to everyone. Not only big pieces, but small pieces. You know, you saw how people hacked down the wall. I mean, the amazing thing is there is very little wall left in Berlin. There is only one instance that I can remember around Bornholmer Straße, where the wall first fell, where there is a section of the wall that is preserved. So there is very little wall left in Berlin. You know, it all has been taken out to the world in pieces of the wall and become a souvenir, if you will. So, by the way, this is the Bush Library over in Texas. This is the Reagan Library in Simi Valley. So there was a big commemoration for the 25th anniversary of the wall in 2014. And I assume that's going to continue in the future. When we have the 50th anniversary, it will be much bigger than the 35th, what we are celebrating today. Because remember, this is about the time in late October, early November, when events happened in Eastern Europe and the wall came down. So I think it's going to continue to be commemorated as a big Cold War event, particularly in Germany. And we are staying ahead of that. But that's it, folks. Thank you for your attention. And thank you, Brian, for making the PowerPoint work after all, and Mark for helping me scroll through it. So thanks, folks. But I'll be happy to take some questions. Do we have any in the chat?
I will look, and I just want to say thank you, Günter, for bearing with us with some technical issues. And I just want to open it up to everybody watching via Zoom. Thank you for your patience as well. If you want to ask a question, you could either type it into the Q&A or the chat, or you could also unmute yourself. First, I think I'll see if there's any questions in the room.
Yeah, sir.
Thanks for the presentation. You know, as we were talking about this, these dates were sort of lining up in my mind. These events take place almost exactly a year after the US presidential election in 1988.
Yeah.
And to some extent, it's kind of coincidental, I guess, well, maybe not coincidental. It takes place in a year where there's no midterm election either in the US. How do you think these events might have been different had it been during a presidential election year in the US, if at all?
I don't think they would have been very different because of the cautious nature, the way the president who was elected in 1988 reacted. I mean, he took much more time than anybody had foreseen, and that certainly Gorbachev thought in developing his Eastern European policy. I once wrote a paper on this, it's never been published, so I did research. Melanie.
Could you speak into the mic if you would, for the people on Zoom?
Right.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Okay, so the question was if a presidential election would have happened in 1989, would events have been very different? And I think they wouldn't have been very different because of the very nature of the president that was elected in 1988, which was George H.W. Bush, who was a very cautious man, and it took a long time, in spite of people like the ambassador in the Soviet Union pushing him to come out and move much more quickly. But he took his time to develop his no containment policy. And essentially, that is what he then pretty much practiced throughout 1989. What was, I think, different about him was that he stayed true to the Germans. You know, when Gorbachev and his colleagues thought that he was moving too quickly with German unification, he said, I cannot really break down the Germans because we have been allies for a long time, since the end of World War II, and we've promised unification. So if they now see a chance to make it happen, I cannot interfere in that.
Yeah, so you were mentioning about this current dissatisfaction in East Germany. That there's a lot of dissatisfaction. People are very upset. You're saying it's because West Germans, a lot of them come in and taken over their jobs, taken control. So, and then you're saying that a lot of people in East Germany are moving towards a more right-wing party, which I think is kind of ironic when you think that East Germany had been communist prior to that. But what do they want? Like, what exactly is the party proposing that would help the East Germans with their, and maybe you could talk a little bit more about the nature of this dissatisfaction that they have and what people in East Germany are actually hoping for that would change their situation.
Well, the nature of the dissatisfaction, the way I read the signals is that they are very unhappy with the economic situation, with the political development. So they are just unhappy. I mean, right after events happened, a lot of East Germans left East Germany in order to find jobs in the West. I always found it ironic that the biggest immigration group in Austria after 1989 were actually East Germans coming to work in Austrian tourism. That was a big surprise. I mean, that's how they left the country and found new jobs. And I think that sort of is still with them, you know, in terms of every family probably lost family members that came to the West. And the way things happened in 1990 in unification, they largely blame the West Germans for things having gone the way they've gone. And, you know, Kohl probably made a few mistakes. He spoke of blühende Wiesen, you know, the meadows of East Germany were suddenly full of flowers again. He said that should be the result of unification. And the East Germans just didn't see those promises coming to pass. So there was essentially also a policy by Kohl to make unification easy in the sense that suddenly East German marks were worth West German marks. So in that sense, he did them a big favor in sort of elevating their currency towards the very strong Western currency, the German mark. And that probably was a mistake too, because there was no equality in terms of the two economic units whatsoever. Now, if you think about events today, why people are unhappy, I would say, let's wait and see how the American presidential election next week is going. But I see the unhappiness of the East Germans being like the unhappiness of the Austrians, of the French, of the Americans, of all Western democracies that are giving their votes to these radical right-wing parties. So, you know, in that sense, I think you need to look at the state of Western democracies and how they are all infusing one another.
Well, I just had one more question related to that. So I know in 1945, there was a vast amount, millions of German refugees from Poland and from many other countries after Germany lost the war were expelled and had to go back to Germany. So did East Germany absorb more of these refugees, or was it more West Germany?
None. That was all West Germany, because West Germany built housing for them, treated them well, and we are talking about some 13 million people that left Eastern Europe, the German-speaking population of Eastern Europe, which it was assumed in these countries had largely collaborated with the Hitlerites, which is true, yes and no. Not everybody, but a lot of people did. So for that reason, they were kicked out of their old habitats in Eastern Europe, and some 13 million Germans moved to West Germany, and they remained a very conservative voting bloc in West German politics. So if you look at West German elections, the reason why the CDU, CSU, the conservatives, you know, Adenauer's party and so forth, did so well for so long is because these people voted for them, because they had done a lot of good for them. And essentially, the East German exodus that I talked about was sort of following that. But East Germany did not want to take on any of the responsibilities that followed the collapse of the Hitlerite regime. This is the same in denazification and so forth. The East Germans sort of tried to deny and shove away all of that as much as they could. And that is often forgotten.
Günter, this is Mark. We have a question from the chat and
Okay.
From the Zoom audience. At the risk of inviting more technical difficulties, maybe I'll ask, unmute yourself and see if it'll work, Christopher Jackson.
Hi, Günter, can you hear me?
Old Harvard classmate.
Okay.
Christopher Jackson.
There he is.
Hey, Chris.
Hey, Günter, great lecture, really.
We're not hearing you, unfortunately. So
I'm unmuted here.
The question. Oh, maybe try one more time.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
No.
I'll just read it. Okay. I apologize. I am a glutton for punishment. So the question from Christopher Jackson is, did the CDU's big victory in March 1990 come as a result of the already existing CDU party structure that was taken over by the West German CDU?
That's a very difficult question to answer, Chris, but I think essentially the East German CDU formed very much along Western models, and in that sense, it was sort of Kohl imposing his will on East Germany. That's about as close as I can get to that question. You know, you were talking about the development of the CDU and a West German party that has been dominant for a long time and that the East Germans had sort of blocked out. Thanks, Chris. Yeah.
I remember when I was in college, one of the first books that made a big impression on me were George Kennan's memoirs.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember if I remember correctly, one of the things he said that impressed me was he thought containment policy was like we were overdoing it.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember him saying that he thought that spies were sort of useless. He said, if you can read Russian and you can read the kind of publicly available documents about the Russian economy, you can see that the Eastern Bloc is going to kind of fall its own weight eventually because the economy isn't working. And I'm wondering, and then of course, when I grew up in an age when they said, well, we helped them. We made that happen with the arms race, like we drove the Soviet Union into the ground by outspending them and all the rest of it. So I'm wondering now, with more distance from the end of the Cold War, more access to archives, like what's the consensus among historians about kind of how reality finally came and imposed itself? Was it kind of internal or external? I'm sure it was a combination of both. But.
Okay, for those of you who don't know who George Kennan was an American diplomat who worked at the embassy, one of the first American trained, actually he was trained in Germany, Soviet expert. So he worked at the embassy in Moscow in 45, 46. And in 46, he wrote the famous long telegram trying to explain to the American government what was happening with Stalin and with the Soviet Union. And it was sort of a very searing kind of description of the Soviet system, and particularly how Stalin was somebody who didn't travel, didn't look to the West, was sort of totally set in his mindset on the Soviet Union. And supposedly this telegram then was spread in Washington insider circles in the spring of 1946. And this sort of became the truth about what was happening in the Soviet Union, when many Americans couldn't figure out. I mean, remember, the Soviets had been American allies during World War II. And now a year after the war, they are starting a confrontational course. So if you look at the origins of the Cold War and the beginning of the confrontation with the Soviet Union, you have to contend with George Kennan. Now, George Kennan is still largely admired, I would say today, to answer your question, particularly by Cold War historian, which probably has to do with the fact that he had a famous biographer. John Lewis Gaddis. John Gaddis is or has been a professor at Yale for a long time. And he essentially collected all the stuff on Kennan that he could, but he wouldn't write the memoirs before Kennan himself died at the age of 100. And when Kennan passed away at the age of 100, John Gaddis came out with the biography. It's a big book, won a Pulitzer Prize, which sort of tells you it became sort of the Bible on Kennan. And he pretty much distributes the old verities about George Kennan. And that's, I think, why historians are still full of admiration, even though Kennan was a very problematical.
Hello, everyone. This is Mark Landry, Director of Center Austria. My apologies. A campus internet outage terminated the Zoom session just prior to the conclusion of the lecture. Dr. Bischof was just about to finish answering the question about George Kennan and his complicated legacy. One goal of this new lecture series was to raise money for the Dr. Günter Bischof Endowed Scholarship for Travel and Research Fund. So to donate, please go to www.centeraustria.org and scroll down to the green button. Also, scroll down to subscribe to our newsletter for more updates on Center Austria's activities.